you're going to hear all year. I really do think you're lucky to be here. It's going to be fabulous because we have two things we don't often have with panel discussions in Washington. One, we have a fabulous panel who are really experts on what they're talking about and are talking about it at a really timely moment. I don't think you could find a more mature conversation to be having than the issue of NATO enlargement at this particular moment with the Vilnius summit about to come up, with the war in Ukraine happening right now, with the debate you see playing out in books and articles and throughout the political sphere. And I think the other thing you're going to have here today that's really fascinating, if I'm not wrong, is you're going to have disagreement, which is something we don't often have enough of in, I think, some of these discussions in Washington. Too often, at least the panels I find myself involved with, find everybody sort of just saying, yes, I agree, more or less. And I think we should have a robust and dynamic debate about some of the issues we're about to talk about today. We have with us today, we have Jim Goldgeier here, of course, the visiting fellow from the Center on the United States and Europe here at Brookings. Joshua Shifrinson, associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Susan Colburn, the associate director at the Program in American Grand Strategy at Duke University. And of course, we have Jim Townsend, the adjunct senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. We're going to talk for a little bit here, and then we're going to open up for questions, and there'll be people with microphones who will come around. I'm supposed to remind you that this is on the record, is that right? And therefore, just keep that in mind. We're here to have a public conversation. I want to go back to the history of NATO enlargement at some point, but let's just start with where we are right now, because at this very moment, there is a major debate happening between the United States in the form of the Biden administration and its allies in Europe over what to do with Ukraine and NATO in this upcoming Vilnius summit. And while President Biden, I think, has done, surprisingly, I think to a lot of people, a good job of keeping the alliance knit together in the year and a half since the invasion of Ukraine, they are really at loggerheads, it feels like, on how far they want to go right now. So, Jim, why don't we start with you? What do you think we're going to see at Vilnius? What do you think we should see at Vilnius? What should we be doing with Ukraine? And have you changed your mind on this at all?
Well, first of all, Peter, thanks so much for being our guide here through this subject. Thank you all for coming. It's just so great to be at a public event here in the Falk Auditorium at Brookings. After some time not being able to do that, really thrilled to be with my colleagues here, my co-editor for this volume, Evaluating NATO Enlargement, From Cold War Victory to the Russia-Ukraine War, Josh Shifrinson and I, who did this together because we disagree about NATO enlargement, and two of our great chapter authors, Susie Colburn and Jim Townsend. The Biden administration has been very clear that they're not interested at this moment in pursuing membership for Ukraine in NATO. And I think it goes back really to where the president has been since the beginning of this war, which is he wants to do everything he can to support Ukraine and wants to push back against this Russian aggression. But he has said over and over again he doesn't want to start World War III, and he doesn't want American troops to have to be directly involved in the war. And if Ukraine were a member of NATO, it would have an Article 5 security guarantee. It would be, the other members of the alliance would be on the hook for defending Ukraine against Russian aggression. So I understand the perspective. The problem for me, and I will say, I have over time really felt like there were things that we should do for Ukraine other than membership. I just thought, it was too, the potential for escalation was high. Earlier, 2008, when this really became more on the agenda, I was concerned about escalation, concerned about provoking Putin. I mean, provoking Putin, you don't need to provoke Putin. I mean, Putin wants this territory and believes it belongs to Russia, and I don't think he should be allowed to use force to try to accomplish that objective. And so over time, I have come to the conclusion, first of all, that Russian imperialism is the greatest threat to European security. This is not just a Putin issue. It's not just a Russian elite issue. Russian society seems to clearly believe that these lands outside of the Russian Federation, outside the internationally recognized borders of the Russian Federation, many Russian people seem to believe these lands belong to Russia. They don't. And I don't see any other way to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine other than bringing Ukraine into NATO. Because we have seen that Putin is deterred from attacking NATO countries.
So at this point, he is attacking Ukraine. And
Yes.
isn't, therefore, admitting NATO, at least in the short term, tantamount to a declaration of war? Because we would then have to immediately invoke Article 5.
Right. So that's why that's why I understand the sentiment about not moving forward on NATO enlargement. I do think that the administration's perspective seems to be that really that's not even an issue looking out. There's a lot of talk within the administration about the so-called Israel model. You don't provide a security guarantee. You provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to have a qualitative military edge, the ability to defend itself against Russian aggression. But we should remember, the Israel model includes Israel has nuclear weapons. I don't think we want Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. So so again, I understand the sentiment about you don't want to bring a country at war in, but I think that as we look out over the medium term, we need to think about how Ukraine could become a member of NATO, and I think that we should be signaling that more than we are, and it shouldn't really be off the table as it does seem to be for this administration.
So Josh, we're going to get into whether it was wise to expand NATO in the 90s and 2000s, but for the moment, looking now where we are, we can't undo what we did, even if we wanted to. Is it wise at this point then to say, okay, Ukraine too?
So thanks for the question, Peter, and I also want to thank everyone on this panel. I want to thank Jim also for coming to me a number of years ago suggesting that we co-author this thing. That's a preamble to answer your question because Jim and I disagree about Ukraine and NATO as well. I have come to the informed position that taking Ukraine into NATO would be a grave mistake for the United States and for the alliance as a whole. Jim alluded to the problem. Ukraine and Russia are going to be locked, they're going to have a nationalist dispute over a very fractious piece of territory over the foreseeable future. I am personally anti-Russian on this point. I think the Ukrainian territory belongs to Ukraine. But the question must be posed for the United States to support Ukraine joining NATO, and I'm an American, so I'm going to focus on the United States' role here for a second. For the United States to support Ukraine joining NATO, we have to be willing to say we're going to lay our blood, time, treasure, and perhaps lives on the line for the sake of Ukraine. Now, I certainly understand the desire to stop Russian imperialism. I agree that Russian imperialism is a huge problem. The motivation's there. But as we have also seen in Ukraine today, the Russian military threat to the continent of Europe just isn't there. It's not the former Soviet Union. It's not going to run amok and conquer the continent, even have hegemony in a political sense over the continent. So as a result, when you add all these things up, the risks to the United States of getting involved and having to incur an Article 5 guarantee for a dangerous piece of real estate versus the benefits involved. And at the end of the day, Ukraine, unfortunately, for better or worse, is not central to the future of European security, the stability of the continent. I don't think the benefits exceed the costs. I'm reluctant to take Ukraine to NATO.
Does that apply to any kind of sort of half measure or partial measure or future commitment or Israel model or something in your view?
So I'm very sympathetic to the Israel model on this one. I think there is a lot to be said for turning Ukraine to what some people discuss vis-a-vis Taiwan, right? Kind of a very hard thing for any calculating actor to swallow. And I think Putin and the Russian elite around him and many of the Russian people have designs upon Ukraine. So if you were asking me what should be done, I think let's build up the Ukrainian defense industry. Let's help Ukraine root out corruption to become a viable, stable society that is impenetrable or hard for Russia to crack in a political sense, and turn them into something that's going to be very hard for Russia to think, I can get away with this in the future.
Susan, so give us your view of this and tell us a little bit about what you think is going on with the allies being on different pages, because traditionally Washington has been the more forward-leaning member of NATO, and it's the Europeans who have to be dragged along because they're always nervous and you guys are going too far and so forth. And here we are in this odd position where it seems to be the opposite.
Yeah, I think we're in a very interesting situation right now that tracks with some of the old stereotypes, but in some ways illustrates that the alliance is always more complicated than we than our stereotypes leave it to be. I'm a historian, I have to say. It's complicated. We can tick that off the list. I've done it up front. So, but what I see today is we tend to focus, especially in the American debate, very narrowly on the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO and whether the costs or benefits are good for the United States, are good for American interests. But there's also a macro question about what a decision to admit Ukraine, what a decision to close the door on Ukraine entirely, or to any of the half or potential interim measures in between those two ends of the spectrum, what it means for the alliance as a whole. And I wonder what happens to Polish behavior, Hungarian behavior, French behavior, right? How do all of the states of Europe, the other members of the alliance, of which there are 30 other members, right, think about their own security? We feel a sort of degree of comfort that NATO will continue on because it has always continued on. But any good historian of NATO will tell you that virtually every year, open a newspaper and somebody is worried the alliance would fall apart. Just because it hasn't yet doesn't mean it couldn't in the future. And so there are bigger things at stake about what role NATO plays in the broader provision of European security. And right now, it's the only game in town.
Right.
And so I think that there is a potential to undermine that and encourage people to sort of freelance about thinking about what future structures might look like.
And getting all 30 members, 31 members, what we're going to get to, on board with any single strategy and any single policy, I mean, that's just not easy, right? It's one more reason Washington is basically does prefer a sort of bilateral approach to this, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to wrangle all of the allies onto the same page. Historically, in any alliance decision, it has meant that a degree of ambiguity lingers in every decision, right, where it's open to interpretation so everybody's competing interests can coexist. Here, I'm very curious about Eastern European lobbying of Washington. That's the dimension that I'm the most interested in following. But there's also a then fascinating question about how much the Germans would be willing to bear, which has historically been very contentious in this issue.
Right. So, Jim, we have just admitted one more member in Finland. We're almost maybe going to get Sweden in there, depending on what happens in the next few weeks. I mean, what would Ukraine look like in NATO? Would it fit in? Is this something that actually, beyond the exigencies of the moment, makes sense in a longer term? What's your view of that?
Well, it's a great question, and I think part of the answer helps to explain why Ukraine hasn't come in already. Because you remember in 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, the communique said that Georgia and Ukraine will be in NATO. Date uncertain, but they will be in NATO. And of course, in my chapter, I said that helped to light the fuse in a sense of where we are today. Both Georgia and Ukraine were invaded later on, Putin expressing his view about Ukraine coming in. But the point's well taken because one thing about NATO enlargement from the very beginning is enlargement was used to help shape these new allies to look like Western Europe, to fit in around that NATO table. If you remember, they came in after being parts of the Warsaw Pact. In my career, I was there helping them out of the Warsaw Pact into NATO. And so what I saw were countries that really wanted to be democratic, didn't have a lot, depending on the country, they didn't have a lot of experience in it, or with a market economy or a military that looked like a Western military. So a lot of what NATO did, both when these nations were in the Partnership for Peace, but then when they joined NATO as well, is those were all helping to polish and to grind the rough edges from countries so they did fit in. And so when you look at Ukraine, one of the problems that we have had historically about Ukraine membership is of the corruption issue was loomed very large. It was very hard for us to deal with, and they weren't the only country that had that as an issue, but Ukraine had it in a large amount, and there were a lot of special NATO programs and things that the U.S. did to try to help them get away from and fight the corruption aspect of it. And that's what really held them back. We were working with their military quite a bit, particularly after 2014. So I do believe that when we pull Ukraine in, and let's say they come in after the fighting has ceased in some form or fashion, and so that made sense to pull them in. If we did pull them in right away, I think we could still work with them. We've been working with their military now, but we're going to have to deal quite a bit with their civil society. A lot of reconstruction is going to have to be done. There'll be a lot of assistance monies going in there, a lot of private sector investment as well. So there's going to have to be a real wire brushing of a lot of how Ukraine has done business before this war. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much the military integration as much as the civil side, and I think that can certainly be done both through membership in NATO and in the European Union.
You mentioned Bucharest. I was at that summit. This is the NATO summit where George W. Bush wanted to put Georgia and Ukraine on map, what they call membership action plans, which is sort of like a path toward eventual membership. Angela Merkel said, no, no, no. There's this famous scene with her being cornered by the Eastern European leaders saying, yes, yes, yes. And Jim rightly points out that the compromise sort of left nobody very satisfied. It was no map, but a statement just simply saying, you will be members. Okay, when, how is it going to work? So it ended up having, in some ways, some people argued, the worst of both worlds. It provoked Putin, but it also kind of pissed off it also left the Georgians and the Ukrainians feeling not fully satisfied, Saakashvili, of course. So what should they have done at Bucharest? What would have changed where we are today had they done it right at Bucharest, in your view?
Well, I think there's an argument, and we can certainly debate this, but if we were going to make that kind of noise in terms of the George W. Bush administration, and I was I was out of the Pentagon. I was in the Pentagon for like 35 years. At this particular stage, I was out of the Pentagon. I was at a think tank for a couple of years before going back in. And so from what I saw from where I was, what the Bush administration was trying to do was to put a finger in the chest of Putin saying, you're not going to have a veto on who gets into NATO and who doesn't. This is up to the nations. They have a sovereign right. And we're going to, we understand you don't like Ukraine going in or Georgia, but they want to. And we're going to show you right now that they get to come to us. We at NATO decide whether they come in. And we're going to give them the membership action plan to, so it was really a kind of a manhood test, as we used to say, between who was stronger. And so what it ended up being, though, was that they couldn't get consensus, as was said, and so they came up with this neither beast nor fowl a compromise address for it. So what they should have done, though, was probably while putting them out there, is to say, we'll go ahead and bring you into NATO now. I mean, having them drift away into this gray zone with promises to be given and fulfilled in some point down the road left them vulnerable. And so if we were going to have this manhood test and we were going to say you're going to be in, we needed to, at a minimum, give them map, or we needed to do something else to show in a very realistic way that the alliance was serious about this, and we'd be willing to, if the push came to shove, we'd be willing to do a little shoving with the Russians to show them that we were going to bring them in. But we didn't. We just used some wording and a communique, and that was it. And so they were, in a sense, pushed out into this no man's land, and very vulnerable to being invaded, which is what happened.
So. My wife, Susan Glash, and I wrote a book about James Baker, who was the Secretary of State, of course, under George H.W. Bush. And he, of course, had a famously large role in the unification of Germany. And then there's a lot of debate today as to what he meant or what it meant when he, at one point during a hypothetical discussion, said to Gorbachev, well, we won't move NATO 1 inch to the east. I have my view about this, but I'm curious. Let's go to the elephant in the room. Did we promise the Russians in any way? Did we give them any reason to think that we weren't going to expand NATO, or is this a shibboleth on the part of Putin to justify behavior that otherwise would be unjustifiable? It's actually still unjustifiable, but why don't you go, Jim?
Okay, and then we should hear from both Susie. Josh has written directly on this, and Susie as the historian.
And I was there, so
and Jim was there. But let me give you my view. My view is that the important thing to understand about that period, the end of the Soviet Union, and then early into Russia, post-Soviet Russia, is that the assurances that the West gave were that we are not going to, as you retreat from Europe, we are not going to undermine your security. And I think the United States and its allies believe they delivered on that promise. The United States cut the number of troops dramatically that it had in Europe. The United States pursued conventional arms control to reduce the amount of heavy weaponry in Europe. The United States created a partnership for peace to which all of the former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet states were invited. The Russians were included in the post-Dayton implementation force after the end of the war, the Bosnia War in 1995. There was a NATO-Russia Founding Act. I think from a Western perspective, everything was done to assure the Russians that, in fact, there were no nasty designs against them. And I think there's a great chapter in this book by Kim Martin, Barnard Professor Kim Martin, on Russian military views of this. But of course, from the Russian perspective, they're looking at what's going on, and there's NATO, the Cold War alliance, directed against them, and it's getting bigger, and it's getting closer to them. And I just think you just have two unbridgeable positions there. But I don't think you can argue that the West betrayed Russia, that the West was deceitful. I think you had countries with different interests pursuing their interests, and that you just had these unbridgeable positions. But I'm
Josh,
waiting to be
I know
corrected.
you agree. I know you agree with every word you just said.
No. Jim and I are actually in violent agreement on 95% of this.
Yeah.
Look, there are two different questions on the table, right? What was said in 1990 that may have led leaders in Moscow, and I'm going to say Moscow, not because it was the Soviet Union, not Russia at the time, that may have led leaders in Moscow to believe a NATO non-expansion commitment, assurance, guarantee, whatever term one wishes to use, something that says we're probably not going to expand NATO. Was there anything in the record that would support that position? And the second question is, well, how did that play out in the 1990s and beyond, which is what Jim just spoke to? You know, on the first question, I think it is now fairly well established, and I think the archival record is sufficiently robust that there really should no longer be a debate that, yes, there were assurances given in the course of German reunification. It was a particularly scoped moment in time in the course of German reunification that Washington said that NATO would not expand into the former Warsaw Pact, as Jim alluded to, and would respect Soviet interests after German reunification. This was offered by Jim Baker at the time. It was also offered by Bob Gates, who was then the Deputy National Security Advisor. Assurances about respecting Soviet equities were repeated by George H.W. Bush in the diplomacy later on that spring. Unless we think this was just overtaken by events when Germany reunified, as late as March of 1991, the political directors in the United States, Germany, then reunified, Britain and France, meeting to plan for for NATO's post-Cold War future, talked about amongst themselves how they could not contemplate expansion because we had promised the Soviets that NATO would not expand into the East. So I don't think it's a question now that this was on the table. The question becomes, though, once NATO expansion became on the table, what was done to assuage Soviet concerns? And there I think Jim is right. I think many steps were taken to try to reassure the Russians, no longer the Soviet Union, but the Russians, that NATO expansion, even though it was ongoing, would still take into account Russian equities, Russian interests. The problem, and I think Jim captured this nicely, I would just reframe it a little bit, is that for the Russians, the question was, A, would they have influence in post-Cold War Europe? Would they kind of have influence over European security architecture, I think is the term of art. And while there were things done, such as the NATO-Russia Founding Act to try to give Russia a seat at the table, this was kind of understood as not quite the same as what the Russians were asking for, right? So what we're getting at is once NATO began moving east, and I think the collapse of Soviet power plays a large role in this process, the Russians and the Americans and NATO in general were on a collision course where interests were just incompatible in many ways. And Bill Woolforth, a professor at Dartmouth, has a nice chapter that complements Kim Martin's in the book that gets at these issues. So in a real sense, what we're seeing after 1990, it's a tragedy. These are rival powers with rival interests that are just in conflict.
So, Susan, Josh says there's no debate about this historically. You're the historian. I read the October treaty on German reunification, and there's discussion there about whether troops and timing of troops, of the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and NATO troops in eastern Germany. I didn't read in there any commitment not to expand NATO. So did we, if it's not in writing, if it's not part of an agreement, the fact that it comes up in conversation, does that, as a historical thing, what do you think? Do you think that this is reasonable for the Russians to have interpreted that way?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think the debate hinges in so many respects on semantics, right? What is a pledge? What is a promise? What is an assurance? Even take the language Josh used here. It was on the table. It was, an assurance was made. Was the assurance binding, right? There are bigger questions. So yes, in the historical record is very clear that in the conversations surrounding German unification, James Baker did hypothetically raise the possibility of what if NATO were to expand not 1 inch eastward. All right, that's a rough paraphrase. At the same time, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the longtime West German foreign minister, was out publicly talking in stump speeches about maybe limiting NATO's role in some places, right? This is a time where the context is so key. Western leaders are looking for a way to make German unification possible after 40 years and umpteen proposals bandied about how that unification might happen that had not come true. But at the end of the day, what is agreed in the 2+4, what is enshrined in the October Treaty for German unification does not include those binding assurances. And crucially, I would distinguish here something that I think is often lost in the debate, which is that NATO can be many things. And so NATO makes military agreements not to station parts of its forces in the 5-lender that had been the GDR. So NATO does follow through with at least one interpretation of exactly the assurances that Josh is talking about. And then, of course, in the rest of 1990 and through 1991, the context changes as it's clear the Soviet Union is dissolving. So I understand why Russian policymakers looking for arguments love these arguments. But do I think that we should buy them hook, line, and sinker? No, I don't. That's not how I read the historical record.
I'm going to come back to Josh, but Jim, you were there. What do you think? What do we agree to? What do we not agree to? Are we rewriting history?
Boy, I tell you, Josh was the first one who planted the seed in my mind after I left the Pentagon in 2017. He planted this seed saying, you guys really screwed up with NATO enlargement. I didn't put it that way.
I don't think it was that polite.
I guess I would say a couple things. One is, I never heard anyone at any time refer to agreements or anything that would limit what we could do. And it never was a topic. And I think really it's kind of what was just said about the context of the times. As this enlargement was beginning in the early 1990s and then into the Clinton administration, the Russia we were dealing with and the Russian leadership that we were dealing with and the outlook of European security that we thought we were heading towards, the idea of enlarging NATO wasn't, we didn't perceive that action as something that would be threatening anyone. And we, and I will say there was probably a lot of assumptions taken in the government, a little bit starry-eyed about this new period, the end of history and all of that. But there just was this feeling that, and an assumption that Russia, for instance, should be very happy to have a NATO nation on its borders, because that you would want a nation that was stable and belonging to a defensive alliance, that would be a non-threatening nation on your border. So as far as the Soviet Union or then Russia was concerned, that should not be a threat to them. A growing NATO should not be a threat. That was our assumptions. And I'm not sure if the Russians ever said, yeah, well, that's ours too. But but what I'll say is that as
Baker actually did ask at one point, Gorbachev, would you rather have a fully unified Germany inside of NATO and therefore, in effect, a stable actor within this alliance or not?
Yep.
And he did say yes to that. That's not the commitment to the rest of it, obviously.
And that's a really good point to make, because the 1990s was one thing. But after into the 2000s, it was a totally different picture. And not to go on too long, but in the late 90s, we really bent over backwards as we did the first round, the first 3 nations coming in. We bent over backwards not to be seen as threatening. We even did away with talking about NATO enlargement. NATO expansion, that's what we used to call it. And then we said, no, we got to call it NATO enlargement. It's less threatening, and that was the rule. And so there we go. There are all kinds of limitations that we put on
all
ourselves so that we didn't look threatening. And when the three nations came in, it went pretty smoothly in terms of dealing with the Russians on this. And there was constant communications with them. And if you go back and read the communiques from the Madrid summit and from the Washington summit in the late 1990s, you'll see all these things about programs with Russia to try to make sure they knew that they were part of this, and it was going to be a new Europe, and the that Europe would take into account Russian concerns. I remember going to the Hill with my boss and talking to staff about Russia joining NATO. So I mean, it got that far as we were actually talking about it. But it's when we crossed into the 2000s, and I think when we had the second round, which was very large, it wasn't the three, it was the Big Bang, it was called, and they came in with the three Balts, and I think that combined with Putin being in, who had a different frame of reference, and other things that were beginning to sour the relationship between Russia and the West, I think that things began to turn then, and I don't think we were listening or believing what we were hearing. We had set in our minds a certain perspective in terms of how the Russians must look on enlargement and how we look to the Russians in terms of enlargement. That was in our minds, and as things began to change on the ground, we weren't necessarily changing our assumptions.
Well, Susan, let me ask you about this question, because the aforementioned Jim Baker does write an op-ed in the New York Times after he leaves office saying, hey, what about Russia in NATO? Is that a fanciful notion? Should we have actually pursued that? Was it nonsensical, or would that have made a difference?
I think it wasn't fanciful in the 1990s. I think it's sometimes hard from the vantage point of 2023 to remember what the 90s were like. But this is a period of time where people were talking about disbanding NATO entirely, talking about building out the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, which then became the OSCE, into a pan-European architecture. So the prospect of Russia joining NATO was one of a number of permutations that could have been on the table to take an architecture that had been built for a divided Europe and make it one for what the first President Bush called a Europe whole and free. And so it sounds wild now, right, to say that in 1995 people seriously talked about Russia joining NATO, but it was there as a real option. I think the biggest thing that shines through in the historical record to me is that it wasn't unique to American policymakers, but it plagued the Clinton administration in particular. There was a circle, a square. They couldn't circle the square the circle. Pick your ordering between how you could atone for what had been done to the Central and Eastern Europeans of over 40 years of being relegated to Soviet rule, and could you do that in a way that didn't alienate the Russians? And that, to me, seems the puzzle of the 1990s. And maybe this is the historian in me, but I look back at that and sort of wonder, there's a great temptation now to Monday morning quarterback and say there was a great missed opportunity, and I just wonder if there were only bad and worse choices.
That's usually Washington's best
Yeah.
choice. Right? So Josh, we talk about assurances and whether the Russians had, first the Soviets and the Russians had reason to think that's what they were being told, even if it wasn't in writing. How do we square that, though, with the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when Russia did make in writing a commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty and its territorial boundaries in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, and this is then obviously signed by the United States and the United Kingdom as well. If Russia is going to hold us to an assurance that was on the table, let's say, what do we think about the way they have literally violated a written agreement?
Oh yeah, no, you're 100% right. States lie, cheat, and steal all the time.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just give my comments at that. Written words are often violated in practice. Agreements are often overtaken by events. This sounds cynical on my part, but tragically, international law is only upheld by the different states involved. It's very hard to get a central authority to uphold them to this. I'll just say, too, when it comes to Budapest, it's important to remember that at the time, people were worried about Ukraine holding onto its nuclear weapons and engaging in nefarious activities of their own. So in a way, Russian and American interests aligned when on the Ukrainian issue in a way that they don't quite align today. And in that sense, I'm not surprised that when Russia wants to push back at NATO enlargement, they point to the assurances of 1990, and that when we want to point out all the nefarious Russian behavior, we point out that they violated the Budapest Memorandum. Yes, this is a tragedy of the highest proportions, and we ought to be. We ought to lament it.
Yeah, Jim, did Ukraine make a mistake? What they wanted out of this was in effect, writing into to permanent ink that they were a country, that they were an independent nation, that they were everything that Putin says they're not. And they gave up the best card they had to guarantee that, in effect, for a piece of paper. Did they make a mistake by giving up I mean, we are glad they gave up the nuclear weapons for all the proliferation purposes that the United States would have, but is that a mistake on the part of the Ukrainians at this point, looking back?
Well, you know, I meant to say this earlier. The book that Peter and Susan wrote on James Baker is just a fantastic book, and really encourage you to read. And in that period, as the Soviet Union was breaking apart at the end of 1991, it really was James Baker within the U.S. administration. There were a lot of different views within the U.S. administration about how to think about the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the time of the collapse, at the end of 1991, there were 4 countries that inherited on their territory strategic nuclear weapons: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. It was really Baker who pushed this idea. Look, there was one nuclear weapons state when it was the Soviet Union, and when the dust settles, there should just be one afterwards. We shouldn't have more than one nuclear weapons state. Not everybody felt that way, and there were a lot of voices in the Pentagon. Wait, you know, Ukraine, this is our chance to have a country like Ukraine being its own deterrent force against Russia. Ukraine wanted our support it's becoming independent. It needs Western assistance. It really couldn't afford to alienate the United States. Also, just because the weapons were located on their territory didn't mean they controlled those weapons. They were still controlled from Moscow, and it would have cost a lot of resources to maintain it. Let's just say that they kept the weapons and established control over them. You know, that's a big resource sink as well for a country that's just developing. So I think at the time, the calculation made sense. And I'll just say, as somebody who was working on the National Security Council staff in 1996, I mean, on June 1st, 1996, when that last weapon left Ukraine, and something that Bill Perry, as Secretary of Defense, had worked so hard on, Ash Carter. I mean, we were sitting, watching this from watching. I was here in Washington, and thinking, what an amazing, great moment. The last strategic weapon has left this territory, and sunflowers are, planted there where, the silo was. And so, but, and this is, Susie's point about, how things look in 1994 and 1996 compared to how they look in 2023, and what our expectations were with respect to both Russian ability to carry out military action against these countries and Russian intentions to do so. And, now we would say, oh my gosh, Bill Clinton is now saying, well, I guess, they probably should have kept their nuclear weapons. Yeah. But I think that transition, if they had decided to keep them, I think there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong at the time. I think that's right.
Yeah. Susan, so Jim talks about when things began to turn and maybe we didn't listen enough. I'm reminded that in 2002, when Putin was relatively new in power, he gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, my friend Andy Higgins and Carrie Elliott House, and he was asked about NATO expansion to the Balts. And this was thought to be, at the time, if not a red line, certainly a further expansion or enlargement, whatever the word is, beyond simply Warsaw Pact members, but literally into former Soviet territory, and maybe that would be something too far. And Putin said at that time, well, look, we're not happy about it, but basically every country gets to decide its own defensive alignments and agreements. He really didn't make a huge protest about it. So what do you think happened in looking back at this history in 25 years? I mean, at some point, did it was just simply Ukraine and Georgia just too much? Was it just, again, I want to come back to this idea of a justification. Did his mind change? We get into this debate about Putin all the time, right? Was he always who he is today? Was there a point at which he could have been something different? We did do a lot. We brought them into the G8. We brought them into the WTO. We did a lot to try to integrate them into the world architecture. Could Putin have, and yet, by 2007, he's talking in Munich about the Third Reich and all that. How do you see that history and that evolution, if there is one?
Yeah, I would love to know what Vladimir Putin thinks, but I suspect Vladimir Putin would also like to know what he thinks. I don't believe he's a remarkably consistent person. I mean, his views have changed over time. I would say on the specific question of expansion, enlargement, and where the Russian red line was, if there was one, anyone who's familiar with Russian imperial or Soviet history, it's maybe not surprising that the Baltics are different than Ukraine. In the minds of someone in Moscow, right? Ukraine has often been seen as an integral part of what makes Russia a truly great power, right? Spig Brzezinski used to always say this, that when Russia had Ukraine, they were a great power in the world, and when they didn't have Ukrainian territory, they were significantly less important. And I don't think Putin is unusual in that respect. Jim said this at the top, but right, we talk a lot about this being Putin's war, or act like if Vladimir Putin mysteriously gets hit by a bus tomorrow, this is going to go away. This is a Russia problem. Russians broadly, many Russians believe broadly that Ukraine is not a distinct country. So there is an element of that. But in laying that out, that's not a question necessarily about NATO. That's a question about Ukraine and what kind of Ukraine Russians can live with. And here I would come back to 2013, 2014 and say, of course, the catalyst for the first Russian move against the Donbass and Crimea is not NATO, it's the EU, right? It's the prospect of a truly Western and democratized Ukraine, because I think Putin and many Russian leaders believe that if a Ukraine on their borders is independent, thriving, Western-looking, and democratic, that Russians, who see such a great affinity and have so many ties with Ukraine, will wonder why they can't have the same thing at home. And so I think it's very difficult to disaggregate where NATO fits in the puzzle, but it's not as neat a story as the one I think Putin likes to tell.
Well, Jim, in fact, I mean, we talk about the Bucharest summit and how they didn't give the map. I mean, is really NATO a factor here? I mean, as Susan just said, I mean, EU may have been a bigger one. They weren't about to join NATO in 2022. They were simply not, right? And that doesn't mean that they weren't someday down the road, but there's nothing that would suggest we have to do this now, because if we don't,
Yeah, no,
right?
that's exactly right.
Josh will tell me I'm wrong, but.
No, that's exactly right. 2022, it was the Maidan. It was the feeling in Moscow that that Putin and his people were losing control in Kyiv. They had a history of having pro-Russian leadership there, and it looked like that was on the run, and things are beginning to shift, and that the EU was making inroads, and NATO wasn't part of it. NATO was part of the conversation with Ukraine earlier. And then that shifted, and they decided, I think they even took it out of their constitution or something, where they still kept the relationship, but the focus was on the EU first. So it really was an EU thing. I think that NATO's role in this certainly was as an excuse. I think it made to Moscow, to Putin, as they were trying to justify this invasion, blaming it on NATO, blaming it on enlargement, you guys are getting too close. That was a very convenient excuse. I will say, though, that the mood music was part of NATO enlargement. That's how I referred to it. It wasn't necessarily the reason. It wasn't the fuse, but it was the mood music behind a lot of it. So I've wrestled with that ever since Josh planted that seed. I have wrestled with the role of NATO enlargement and all this, and I don't think you can sit there and say it had nothing to do with what's happening. I think that helped, that set this nasty mood in the Kremlin, and as the EU was getting closer to Kyiv, and control was lost in Kyiv, it all kind of came together into this chemical imbalance in Putin's head that also included his view of Russia's history and Ukraine's history and everything else in that soup that he has in his mind that has led to this invasion. I think NATO enlargement was in that, but it was much more of a background thing than as a silver bullet reason.
So, Josh, let's play what if, because why not? And you're now President Clinton's national security advisor.
All right.
And he says, okay, Josh, what do we do with NATO? Do we keep it? Do we get rid of it? Do we expand it? Or do we enlarge it? Whatever word. What do we do with NATO now that Russia is in theory not our friend, and Boris, while we like Boris?
So we're talking about 93, 94,
yes,
95.
before the first three.
Look, I think the history of the 20th century is the history of European internecine warfare, right? Europe self-immolating a couple of times. And I think the American foreign policy community understandably has a story about this. It's 1919, we went home, Europe went bad again. 1945, we stuck around, Europe stayed at peace. Let's stick around. I think that's an understandable perspective. I think the argument that was developed is if you build international institutions, if you create lots of liberal democracies, if you encourage economic integration, you can assuage some of these internecine competitive tendencies, avoid a repeat of the First and Second World War. And I think in the early 1990s, say 90, 91, 92, 93, it's reasonable to keep NATO intact, right? It's reasonable as a hedge because you don't know in this highly uncertain time. By 94, 95, 96, as it becomes clear that Russia is not just democratized, but also a basket case of a country, I think if we're going to talk about the 1990s, we're going to talk about how really problematic Russia was as a power, how weak it was as a country. So we see the spread of democracy across Central and Eastern Europe, largely because of the EU, more so than NATO at the time, or the choices of Eastern European reformers as well, more so than NATO. As we see the spread of globalization, as we see the spread of, as we see European integration, calls to transform the CSE into the OSCE, we had a moment of opportunity to say, you know what, maybe NATO isn't so central. And this is not a call for isolationism. I want to be clear about this. This is a call for saying, in some ways, the American project in Europe has been a massive success for the 1990s, and everything since then has been adding icing to the cake. I think it would have been a natural opportunity to pause for a second and say, look, at a time when it looks like the EU, which was then coming into creation, really wants to take more responsibility for European security, maybe the United States can play a complementary role rather than being the security provider of first.
But does that mean NATO still exists with it down the middle of Europe, or do we just pull it back and just not and try to create something else, go with the OSCE model?
I don't think the OSCE model makes sense, but I do think an EU model with NATO as an ancillary, kind of like how the inverse of what we ultimately did, where NATO was the primary with EU forces supplementing. I would have advocated for the EU taking on more responsibility with NATO playing a reinforcing role, holding NATO probably where it was in 1991 after German reunification, engaging in the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, then the PFP for the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, engaging Russia through the PFP and other mechanisms, and encouraging our democratic, strong, rich, and capable allies to pick up more of the burden in Europe.
Does EU expansion, though, eastward, even if Jim Baker didn't talk about it one way or the other, still provoke Moscow? I mean, it's not military, but...
Right, so I don't think EU expansion is as challenging to Moscow, certainly not in the 1990s, and I would argue probably not today as much as NATO expansion. I do think it's worth talking a little bit more about the role NATO played in the current crisis in Ukraine, the current war in Ukraine, the prior war in Ukraine. Because although it's true that it was EU expansion more so than NATO expansion in 2014 that was on the table, I think it's a worthwhile question to ask, how distinguishable are these things? After all, the United States and NATO itself has talked about for years NATO and the EU moving in lockstep when it comes to expansion. So it is very plausible to me, I'm often the hypothesis, it's very plausible to me that in 2014, when we see the Maidan revolution, when we see the EU making inroads or the Ukraine seeking to join the EU, that distinction between, it's only the EU, it's not going to be NATO, may not have been as sharp as we would like it to be in retrospect. So I would just offer that in current events.
So Jim, Keith Yassin wrote in the New Yorker just the other day, he takes his argument and expands it in effect, says that we, the West, were rubbing the Russians' nose in it, basically, and that we brought this on ourselves. And I don't know if you saw, there was a social media response from Eric Rubin, who had been the DCM, of course, in Moscow at one point when we were there, in fact, saying nonsense, we're buying into Putin's theory that it's all our fault at this point. Is the very debate that we're having, is this conversation that we're having right now playing into Putin's hands?
Well, I think it's important to have this conversation, and one of the reasons that we pursued this project, one of the reasons that I wanted to work with Josh is that I feel like I don't think the debate over NATO enlargement has been very productive. I think it's lacked a lot of nuance. As Josh and I have been talking about, and we write about here and elsewhere, you can't really evaluate NATO enlargement as a policy unless you compare it to the alternatives. Mm-hmm. To say NATO enlargement was terrible and we shouldn't have done it and it ruined everything, The natural thing then to say is, okay, then what would you have done instead? Josh gave you an answer about what he would have done instead. I think too many people who complain about NATO enlargement don't say what they would have done instead. A lot of people say to me, how could you have worked with Shifrinson? Like, you guys don't agree on anything.
Karen said the same thing.
I say, okay, you know, there were times when there were sentences that we had to negotiate for quite some time because, you know, until we could come to agreement. But the reason we were able to work together is we largely agree on the costs and benefits of NATO enlargement.
Right.
We agree that NATO enlargement created security and stability for Central and Eastern Europe. They're more secure because they came into NATO than they would have been absent that. We also agree that NATO enlargement contributed to the deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations. But we put different weights on these things. Why do I support enlargement? Because I believe it had huge benefits for Central and Eastern Europe, and I don't think the U.S.-Russia relationship would look that different absent NATO enlargement. If you look at the rounds we've been talking about, 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic come in. March of 1999, the United States and its NATO allies were going to war against Serbia over Kosovo, a much bigger deal for the Russians. They were much more. Yeltsin, if you look at the declassified memorandum of conversation between Clinton and Yeltsin during the Clinton presidency, that's the thing that set Yeltsin off the most, was Kosovo. 2004, Jim mentioned the Big Bang, the 7 countries that come in, including the 3 Baltics. You also have at the same time the Orange Revolution. Much bigger deal for Putin because he thinks we're there, you know, promoting democracy in these countries around Russia, trying to change the regimes, and his is going to be next. That's what he thinks we're going after him. All sorts of, you know, 2001 walking away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the 2011 war against Libya and the overthrow and then the death of Muammar Gaddafi. I mean,
The Iraq War.
The Iraq War in 2003. There are all sorts of other things. You know, people focus on NATO enlargement. There were lots of reasons for Putin to be upset, just as there were reasons for us, in turn, to be upset about the way what Putin was doing within Russia in terms of increasing its repression, in terms of Putin's attitudes toward the neighbors and what that was going to mean towards European security, and then, of course, later interference in the in American elections. So I think that to argue sort of we did this to them,
Right.
I don't buy it, and I think that we obsess about NATO enlargement when we really should be looking at this broader set of issues, and we shouldn't forget Central and Eastern Europeans wanted to be in this alliance. Yeah. We now see why they really wanted to be in this alliance, and it had huge benefits across Europe. I would invite you to think about what Eastern Europe would look like if the rest of Eastern Europe wasn't in NATO.
Well, I mean, to Jim, to Jim's point, this is actually, I think, a Strobe Talbot point, too, of course, one of the architects of NATO enlargement in the 90s. He would say, if you're in the Balts and you're in Poland, aren't you really glad you were NATO? And we see that there's a result because they have not and probably would not militarily intervene in those places because of that. And had Ukraine been a member, would they have been safe? But it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, though, Jim. Isn't it a little bit, I mean, like, they're protected because we put NATO there, but they're provoked because, you're Eastern Europeans, but the Russians are provoked because we put NATO there. I mean, in the alternative history where we didn't expand NATO to the Russian border, should we have thought, looking back on it, that they would be unsafe today? Do we think that Putin might have thought about doing something?
To the Balts.
To the Balts.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, Baltic security has always been on the minds of all of the practitioners. I'm a practitioner. It has been on our minds from the very beginning. What can we do with the Balts? The Balts wanted to come in very, very, very eagerly, banging on the door along with Poland. And we kept thinking that how can we even defend them? How will this work? But feeling, like you were kind of alluding to, feeling that they would be a morsel right there on the border, we had a lot of scenarios of what the Russians could do to humiliate NATO, the so-called Narva grab, which is that little part of Estonia where Narva is, and that the Russians could put some troops just across the border in there, seize that town and say, okay, NATO, what are you going to do about it? Throw us into this this debate over, do we give up Los Angeles for the Narva Peninsula, and so trying to determine how do you deter, that concern hasn't gone away. When 2014, I was in the Pentagon, and when they first went into Crimea, my great fear was that they might also do Estonia then. If we didn't respond, when our response at the time, you might remember, particularly that first year, was not a great response. And so my great fear was that we were not deterring enough with our actions in 2014, deterring Putin from going into Estonia, and that was a great concern. So I think I would rather have the three Balts in NATO and having all of us figure out how can we protect them than have them in a gray area where it's always going to be a concern and a test of NATO, just like Ukraine. Even though they're not in NATO, if there is a horrific invasion and they're sucked back into Russia, do we just sit back and it's, shades of the late 1930s? What do we do? And so I'd rather have them in NATO and protected and tools to deal with deterrence than to let them just dangle out there and hope that nothing happens.
You said that our response in 2014 was not a great response. What should we have done?
Well, we should have done something similar to what we're doing now, quite frankly. And there was quite a debate in the Pentagon. I guess I'm getting ready to make some news here. I hope not, but quite a debate over whether we should provide lethal aid or not. And there was the same concerns in the White House about escalation and this type of thing. And the decisions were made that we were going to lean on sanctions and have that be the tool. And instead, we were going to provide logistical assistance and, worthy assistance to Ukraine in 2014, but not the lethal kinds of things that you're seeing now. And I think, and Europe pretty much followed in our wake, and the Poles and others were angry. They were furious, saying, how can you provide them these radars when we've got to give them, weapons? So I think, frankly, we opted to go a softer route, and I think that probably emboldened Putin to go in 2022, thinking that would be the same response, because it's the same people, frankly, that are in government today around Biden that were there too. Right. And I love them. They're all my friends. Please don't tell them I'm saying this.
But Susan, that actually raises the elephant in the room we haven't addressed, and we're going to open it up for questions in just about 3 minutes or so, so get your questions ready. The elephant in the room we haven't talked about, of course, is the president who came between Obama and Biden. And that just sort of throws a lot of this up into the air, right? I mean, because in our reporting for our book on Trump, The Divider, we think he was very serious about getting out of NATO. And had he had a different group of advisors around him, he might have done it. And that we only have NATO today, at least as we think of it today, because he had a few advisors around who basically threw themselves into the breach. He might come back. Putin is watching this. What do we think about the impact of that on NATO and on where we are, vis-a-vis Russia today, given that he's not done?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest question, and it's the thing that is, I would describe it as the elephant in the room of the larger strategic debate. A lot of people don't acknowledge this publicly, but I think that part of the reason there has been such an appetite in Western European capitals in particular to rethink the fundamentals of security and strategy in Europe, it is not just the immediate catalyst of Ukraine and Russia's invasion, but is the prospect that there is about 2 years before they potentially have a president who is on the record about his feelings about keeping them safe. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like Macron has ramped up his calls for European strategic autonomy, that the Germans have moved in a way that, though you can take issue with how quickly they've moved, have shown a willingness to talk about some things that they haven't talked about in a generation. The British are starting to think about new mini-lateral configurations, pulling out ideas from the 1930s security architecture of Europe, which, we can have some quibbles about whether that's the historical playbook you want to go back to, given what happened afterwards. But the point is that they're going back to the drawing board to think about other arrangements. I mean, I have been surprised that the question about Ukrainian membership in NATO and what a path to Ukrainian membership in NATO looks like for those who advocate it, I have been surprised at how little of the debate that has played out publicly has acknowledged that there is this big question mark looming in the near future.
Yeah, huge.
Which is there's a potential cost. If you do not move now, who is in office in 2024?
That's exactly right.
Right, right. Okay, why don't we go ahead and see what the audience has in mind here. We've got a microphone here and a microphone here. Why don't we start right here, and then right here.
Hi, Jorgen Andrews. I'm a State Department Fellow at U.S. Institute of Peace. If you're thinking about rebranding the NATO enlargement phrase, I would offer NATO engagement, and that gives you a window to my question. When we talk about Ukraine membership in NATO, why do we assume that Article 5 requires boots on the ground? I mean, a careful reading of the actual text, as well as the one historical precedent we have when Article 5 was invoked on 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan. Some NATO allies participated in Afghanistan, some didn't, some did other things. I mean, we have a country in Ukraine that is able and willing to defend itself. It just needs weapons and some money and some other support. So why does admitting Ukraine into NATO suddenly mean that U.S. boots are going to be on the ground? I mean, I don't think it requires the escalatory ladder.
Ukrainian membership may just be what we're already doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I am all in favor of reading Article 5 carefully and actually interpreting Article 5 in what I would call the proper way. It doesn't require you to go to war. That's the legal interpretation. I think politically, though, there actually, as we know from the Cold War experience and the post-Cold War experiences, we saw in the discussions with the Baltics in 03, 04, and beyond, Article 5 is interpreted as support, including up to and very plausibly including the use of force, including American use of force. This was the experience of the Cold War, where initially NATO was going to, Article 5, and NATO was going to help the Europeans stand on their own 2 feet. We would back away. That was overtaken by events. As the Cold War went onward, the U.S. gradually created mechanisms so the U.S. would automatically be required to fight on behalf of the threatened countries, including nuclear weapons up to that level. Post-Cold War, we've seen, and Jim was talking about how the Baltic states and many of the other new members of NATO want a security guarantee, want Article 5 guarantees, because it brings the United States into the war, not as a supplier of last resort, but as an active combat participant. So I think it is entirely true what Article 5 could be interpreted as in a legal sense. I think politically we're in a very different world.
Anybody disagree with that?
No.
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, I would say that politically Article 5 has, you could read the alliance's history in another way completely, which is that the huge value of Article 5 has been the promise that it will never be invoked, right?
You don't need Article 5.
No, because the promise matters, right? The hope has always been that deterrence would operate in a way, right? I mean, if you look at how NATO was originally conceptualized, we, in retrospect, say, oh, it was designed to stop the Soviet army from sweeping across the continent of Europe. That is not what it was designed for in 1947, 1948, 1949.
Correct.
What it was designed for was to build self-confidence in our European partners and allies,
right,
to make it so that they would be robust enough societies after the devastation of World War II to stand up to Soviet political blackmail. Well, why does that logic not obtain today?
Sure,
potentially?
I take the point. I'd agree with that interpretation. I would just say that if Article 5 can mean that in the breach we'll step back, look, we're already having a debate over American credibility over did we do enough for Ukraine, even though Ukraine isn't in NATO. In the scenario we have an Article 5 guarantee and then back away, I don't want to. If that's the case, I don't want to hear anyone ever mention credibility ever again.
But I think, you know, one of the reasons why I support Ukraine coming into NATO is I don't see another path to be able to deter Russian aggression against Ukraine in the long run. You know, we haven't mentioned, I mean, there's been talk in the run-up to the Vilnius summit. Countries have been talking about security guarantees outside of NATO.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not even sure what that means. And the importance of Article 5, and here's why I think Susie's point is so critical. There's been a lot of discussion about how, you know, Joe Biden doesn't want to start World War III. There's limits to what he wants to do because he doesn't want direct U.S. engagement because he doesn't want a NATO-Russia war. We've also seen Putin doesn't want a NATO-Russia war.
Yeah.
Putin, you know, if you're Russia, you're watching weapons come in from Poland into Ukraine. Wouldn't you want to bomb those supply lines so that they couldn't do it? Well, he's not doing that. Why? Poland's in NATO. He is deterred from attacking a NATO country. And I think that's why the promise of NATO enlargement for Ukraine is so important to deter future Russian
Jim, you
aggression.
want to add anything, or we're good?
Well, it's just interesting to think about what would be going through Putin's mind if suddenly they had the Article 5. And one thing I would worry about is a preemptive type of attack. Because I think the assumption that Putin and his people would make was, well, that's NATO's intent. They've thrown Ukraine without even a debate. They've given Ukraine NATO membership. They've got Article 5 now. That means NATO is going to be involved on the ground very quickly, and therefore right now, before they start, let's go ahead and start bombing those supply lines. Let's go ahead and do what we can before NATO comes. So I think we do have to think a little bit about what the response could be out of the Kremlin. It could be something that would surprise us.
Okay. We have one right here, right?
After the Second World War, there was a division of Europe with, the agreements at Potsdam and Yalta, and we neutralized Austria. Russia agreed not to interfere in Greece, and all these sort of arrangements were made, and that stability lasted for a long time. And it seems now that we're sort of pushing back on that. In other words, we're saying maybe we should enlarge NATO, maybe we should improve American influence, European influence in Europe. And I think that's concerned Putin, and I think that we should think, why weren't the agreements that made after the Second World War still viable today?
Is there a way to make those kind of agreements that we made after World War II, where we were kind of dividing up countries? I mean, Stalin and Churchill, and they're passing around a piece of paper with percentages and stuff. I mean, are those kind of spheres of influence even realistic in today's world, at least in the Western way of thinking, Jim?
Well, I just think, again, for me, the problem is that Russia is not content to live within its internationally recognized 1991 borders. If it was content to live within those borders, I think the West would do everything it could to assure Russia that its legitimate security interests to have those borders respected and not violated, that the West would be fully supportive of that. The problem is, and in my view, that's a big enough country. I'm really unclear as to why Russia cannot be content to live within those borders. Why does it have designs on these territories outside those borders? These other territories don't belong to Russia. And I just don't think you can have an agreement with a country that has these designs on other territories and is willing to use force to conquer them. The entire UN system, created at the end of the Second World War, was at its fundamental level is to prevent what occurred previously, which was big countries taking their militaries, marching into other countries and taking their territory. That's what the UN is designed to prevent, and that's why so much is at stake for us in not allowing Russia to believe that it can act the way countries did in Europe prior to the Second World War.
Okay. Do we want to go right here?
Thank you, Ted Picone from Brookings. Thanks for the history. It's been really interesting. But let's talk about what's happening now. If it's in our, say, U.S. national interest for Ukraine to be a stable democracy with a thriving economy, then what is the best way to get there? How are we going to create incentives that will bring Ukraine in that direction? It seems to me the EU incentive is more important when you phrase it that way than the security guarantee piece, which is much more complicated. And by putting NATO back a step, you also put the United States back a step from the front line, and you make Brussels the front line. And it's more about peace and economic growth, and maybe that has a lot of positive upside for Russia. On the other hand, of course, the bottom line is that Russia doesn't want a successful democratizing Ukraine next door, or Georgia for that matter, but Ukraine being more important. So it seems to me that's the existential issue that both Ukraine and Russia face. Can you comment a bit on how you see the incentive structure and the ultimate end game here of what Russia is willing to accept next door?
Anybody have a strong view?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, since I had just spoken, but so first of all, on this link between NATO and the EU, I believe that what paved the way for EU enlargement was NATO enlargement. So, for example, I don't believe the Baltic countries would be in the European Union if it wasn't for the fact that their security was guaranteed by NATO. I think the European Union would have been too concerned about the potential insecurity in the Baltics. And I'm not the only one who believes this because the former Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, told Strobe Talbot that the EU would not have enlarged if it hadn't been for NATO enlargement. And I think that's at play also with respect to how long it takes for a country to meet what it needs to do to get into the EU. I do agree with you, hugely important for Ukraine to come into the European Union. But in my view, it's both these things. The question is, why is it so threatening for Russia to have a successful Ukraine, a successful democratic Ukraine next door to Russia? I don't think it is necessarily a threat to Russia, but it is a threat to Putin. Yeah. And that's the problem. It's that Putin in power does not want to see a successful democracy next door.
Josh, Jim got it wrong again.
So Jim and I usually agree, so on this one we'll disagree a little bit. As we established, this isn't a Putin problem. Many people, it's ubiquitous in Russia. They don't want to see Ukraine oriented towards the Western sphere. And go back to a prior question, I would just say that, yes, spheres of influence exist in the modern age. The U.S. has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which no one talks about. But bracketing that issue, Putin lived with a democratizing Ukraine from 1408 onward, certainly 14 onward, and yet he only chose to invade in February of 2022. Why is that? It's hard to explain variation with a constant, right? So I don't think this is about the fact that Ukraine is democratizing. And I guess I would push back a little bit on the premise of the question. If a liberal, democratic, capitalist Ukraine is in national interest, I think that we ought to interrogate that question. I would like to see Ukraine liberal, democratic, and capitalist. I understand why Ukraine wants to be liberal, democratic, and capitalist, but that doesn't translate into an American national security interest. I would argue that Russia is not in a position to threaten hegemony in Europe. The liberal order is not going to be overturned based on what happened in Ukraine. NATO is not going to implode based on what happened in Ukraine. And on all these issues, I think it's a tragedy what's happening in Ukraine. I think it's horrific what's happening in Ukraine. But I guess I would dispute the premise that what happens in Ukraine is an American national interest in a visceral sense that's worth a significant commitment of time, blood, and treasure.
You say it is not.
It is not.
I would disagree, Josh.
I'm here to throw a chum in the water.
I think Ukraine is one thing, but we're dealing with something, and Jim mentioned this. This is a tremendous challenge to what we have built since the end of World War II in terms of the liberal international order in Europe, European security, everything that we've stood for, NATO, the EU, everything that we've built. Russia's actions of invading a neighbor is something that is not just because it's Ukraine and we like Ukraine, but it's what Russia is doing to the system that we have set up and what the precedent is. And that other nations in Europe are now going to be with the covers pulled over their heads because they assume that they're going to be next because NATO didn't stand up, the U.S. didn't stand up, the EU
didn't. But Jim, NATO has stood, just to push back a little bit, NATO has stood up. If you said in February of 2022 that over the course of a year, the NATO and the United States with it would provide 20 years' worth of defense assistance and economic aid to Ukraine. If you would say the U.S. would be willing to go far beyond the red lines established in February of 2022, that looks like a NATO success story. If I can just finish the final thought, I'm sorry to speak over you. But lastly, you say it's a challenge to the liberal system. It seems to me that it's the liberal system working resoundingly well. We wanted to rebuild a Europe that could stand on its own, as Susie mentioned, a Europe that was self-confident. This is a Europe that is taking steps to balance Russia on its own, independent of the United States. This is a resounding success for the system we've created. So I'm curious why we fear that somehow everything else is vital now.
Well, what I'm saying is that have we not done all that? In other words, this is this test that the West has right now, that the United States has, NATO has, we have responded correctly. And we've responded correctly because of what a huge issue this is for us, existential almost. This is something that really defines what we've been trying to do, which means for me, whether it's Ukraine or whoever it is, once Russia invades its neighbor with impunity the way it's done, this becomes a tremendous issue for all of us, and that we have to step forward, and we've done that. And who knows what else more that we may have to do into the future. But the point here is that this isn't just something that we can turn our back on, or something that we can say, well, this is
Right.
they're not in NATO, and
But the question was whether the domestic quality of Ukraine, its liberal democratic bona fides, is a national interest. I'm not. You noticed you're talking about the importance of standing up to Russia in Ukraine. That's different than the quality of Ukraine itself.
Which I think is irrelevant, because it's the act of the invasion itself that has made this so important. No matter what Ukraine turns into, or it's what Russia has done has now provoked and has tried to undercut what we've built, and we have to stand up to it.
It's also worth noting that, Jim's earlier point about the 2014 response, if Josh had been the National Security Advisor in 2014, what he would have recommended would have been the Barack Obama policy in 2014, right? Barack Obama's policy was, look, this isn't great, but the main thing for the United States is to keep this conflict limited to Ukraine. As long as it doesn't spill out beyond Ukraine, it's okay. We're going to sanction Russia and say, you're going to be punished for doing this. We're going to provide Ukraine some assistance, but we're not going to really engage militarily the way we have since February of 2022. I mean, a very Shifrinson response in 2014 compared to the Townsend response
There are two different interpretations here, right? One is this question of, is the conflict is Russian behavior, is the conflict in Ukraine beyond a deterrent failure, or is it a spiral? I'm inclined to say it's a spiral. Many people in this room and on this panel think it's a deterrent failure, and it's a valid debate. It's the debate we're all grappling with in various different ways.
Okay. We are basically out of time. We want to have one last question here real quickly, if we can have a microphone up here real quickly, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Hi, I'm Ken Meyercord. Speaking of Article 5, isn't there another article in the NATO Charter that says the country's commitments to NATO are superseded by that country's national laws? And our national law says the president cannot take us into a war. Congress has to do that.
Susan doesn't say anything. Is that something you want to jump in on?
That's why Article 5 is written the way that it is,
That's
right?
right.
The reason it's not binding is in 1948 and 1949, when the Allies are hammering out an agreement, the Western Europeans and the Canadians really, really want something that is going to be as ironclad as possible, so that if the president changes, they're not being subjected to, every 4 years they go through a new guessing game about what their security looks like. And Article 5 is the consensus that they come up with, that is respectful of the American political system and the fact that the authority ultimately rests with Congress. But let's be real, in an alliance that relies primarily on nuclear weapons, much of the authority rests with the president, because there just isn't enough time to talk to Congress before you fire a nuclear weapon. So Article 5 is not legally binding, right? People think that it's automatically invoked. That's not true. Right? There have to be consultations before it can be invoked. That's part of why it's only been invoked once in the alliance's history. So Article 5 is a recognition of that reality.
All right, good. That's a great way to end it. Thank you very much. We have a great panel here. Thank you for your conversation. I loved seeing you guys mixed up a little bit. That's fun. Thank you to the audience for making time today. This is a really important issue, and I'm glad to see everybody here so engaged. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter.